Did you know that there was actually a 17-year gap between the time of Bilbo's 111st birthday party and when Frodo leaves the Shire? If you're a fan of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, you might not know about this change to Tolkien's original work. And today, as we continue into episode 3 of our series Movies vs. Manuscripts, we will be covering the next 4 scenes of The Fellowship of the Ring that condenses this 17-year gap to seemingly less than a year. We're going to dive into the original text of Tolkien's second chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring book, which is called The Shadow of the Past, and compare it to Peter Jackson's adaptation. Just a reminder, this is a celebration of both the films and the original book series. These videos give us all a chance to nerd out about Middle-earth lore and learn some of the fun details that Tolkien wrote about but were adapted to fit the silver screen. So if you're interested in learning more about Lord of the Rings, stick around as we cover these next few scenes in the Fellowship of the Ring. So without further ado, let's dive right in. To start, let's catch up on what these scenes are all about. In the last episode, we left off with Gandalf telling Frodo to keep it secret and keep it safe. After leaving the Shire, the scene cuts to show Mordor in all of its fiery glory, and we hear the screaming of Shire and Baggins, and the Black Riders head out to presumably find said Shire and Baggins. We then see Gandalf heading to Minas Tirith to search the archives of Gondor to learn more about the One Ring. He reads off the account of Isildur, which talks about the One Ring right after Isildur took it from Sauron's finger, and he learns that the inscription on the ring can only be revealed by fire. We then cut back to a Black Rider coming upon a Hobbit farmer and asking for the Shire and Baggins. After being told that there's no Bagginses around here, the Hobbit points him in the direction to go and the riders storm off. Back in Hobbiton at the Green Dragon, we find Merry and Pippin dancing on a table and some other hobbits talking about the strange things that have been happening recently and the folks that have been coming in and out of town, along with Frodo and Sam there at the table. Once they wrap up their night out, Frodo heads back to Bag End to be surprised by Gandalf lurking in the shadows, and together they throw the ring in the fire, reveal the inscription, and Gandalf proceeds to fill Frodo in on everything that he has missed. After deciding that Frodo must leave the Shire, Gandalf finds Sam lurking outside of the window and brings him inside, where he assigns Sam the task of going with Frodo on this journey to the Prancing Pony and Bree. And that is where we will be leaving off for this episode, as we have quite a few differences to cover just in those few brief scenes. As always, let's start with the category of characters. This is a pretty simple one this week, as we are primarily in the Shire. The characters that we know in these scenes are Merry, Pippin, Sam, Frodo, Gandalf, Gollum, and Isildur. But there are a couple other characters that have roles in Tolkien's writings, and we possibly see in these scenes, but they aren't really named. Those would be Gaffer Gamgee, Farmer Maggot, and Ted Sandyman, who is Sandyman's son, which we mentioned in the previous episode. As for characters mentioned by Tolkien but not shown, we have Deagle and Smeagol, Fatty Bolger, and Folko Boffin. Fatty Bolger and Folko Boffin are named as good friends of Frodo, and Fatty Bolger plays a larger role in the next chapter of Tolkien's book. As for Deagle and Smeagol, of course we know who they are, but they are only named because Tolkien actually provides the full account of Smeagol's acquiring the ring and his backstory through the monologue that Gandalf gives Frodo. We don't see this story until Peter Jackson's Return of the King. In regards to Farmer Maggot, Ted Sandyman, and Gaffer Gamgee, we will cover their involvement once we get to it in the plot differences. As for location changes, there really are none, as everything happens in the Shire and the Green Dragon, and of course at Minas Tirith, but there are a couple of timeline changes, most notable of which is the fact that Peter Jackson shrank the timeline between Bilbo's birthday and Frodo leaving the Shire to just about a year or less. In the books, Gandalf leaves the Shire after Bilbo's farewell and then stops in once or twice a year for the next 8 years. Then he disappears for 9 years straight. Upon his return after that lengthy absence is when we have the conversation between Frodo and Gandalf confirming that the ring he has is the One Ring, and that Frodo should leave the Shire. The second timeline difference is a much smaller one in regards to the account of Isildur. Gandalf reads that the year of the account is second age 3434, but in reality this should have been 3441, as the siege took over 7 years. Even though the siege started in 3434, Sauron's ring was not cut from his finger until the final fight in 3441. It's possible that Peter Jackson changed this date to shrink the siege to just one battle, because that is how he portrays it in the prologue scene, instead of showcasing the whole 7-year siege as written by Tolkien. Okay, so now that we've covered characters, location, and timeline, let's move on to the final category of plot and thematic differences. Per usual, I'm going to try to do this in a somewhat chronological order to keep things organized. So that being said, let's rewind and start with Gandalf leaving the Shire after Bilbo's party. First, keep in mind that a lot of these differences took place during the 17-year interim between the party and Frodo leaving the Shire. So, number 1, Frodo keeps throwing a birthday party every year for Bilbo because he believes that he's still alive, whereas the other hobbits believe that he ran off and died somewhere. Also, Frodo's best friends are Merry and Pippin, and during the 17 years he spends a lot of time with them. His best friend is not Sam. For someone who has never read the books, they might assume that they are already best friends. However, in the books, the bond Sam and Frodo have is much more master and servant. Peter Jackson does a great job of portraying this, but it is worth noting that Sam looks at Frodo as his master and not his buddy, which is why he's always saying, Master Frodo. Frodo's temperament is also a lot more adventurous in the books. Tolkien even describes Frodo as regretting not having gone with Bilbo, and taking long walks at night and talking to dwarven visitors that come along the highway road through the Shire. He seems very similar to Bilbo in his younger years, keen on adventure, albeit buried beneath a hobbit facade. Frodo in the movies seems a lot more reserved, and although he is okay with leaving the Shire, he seems totally content with just staying there. I think this comes from the shortening of the timeline, because in the books, Frodo has 17 years to ponder adventure and think of what Bilbo might be doing, whereas the movie is a lot quicker and doesn't give time for Frodo to develop this desire for adventure. Next, we go on to the Green Dragon, where we see a few hobbits that aren't named, but we can use Tolkien's writings to discern their identities. First, there's Ted Sandyman, Sandyman's son. Then there is Gaffer Gamgee, who Frodo addresses directly and is the father of Sam. I think the older hobbit across from Ted Sandyman might be Sandyman Sr. himself, but that really isn't confirmed. This scene seems to be a combination of two conversations from Tolkien's text. In chapter 1, which I mentioned in last week's video, we witness a conversation between the Gaffer and Sandyman Sr. about Bilbo the week of his party. In chapter 2, however, we have a conversation with Ted Sandyman and Sam Gamgee in the Green Dragon. Sam talks about how he has relatives and friends who have seen large walking tree men, which we know are Ents, and Ted Sandyman says it's all bogus. The film sort of combines these conversations by taking all 4 hobbits and putting them at the Green Dragon, talking about odd things that happened recently, which is pulled from chapter 2, but also talking about how cracked Bilbo and Frodo are, which is part of the conversation from chapter 1. Another difference is that the hobbit we can assume is Ted says, "Keep your nose out of trouble and no trouble will come to you." This line is technically said by the Gaffer in chapter 1 when he's telling Sandyman Sr. about what he tells his son Sam in regards to Bilbo's business. Now, some of you might say that the hobbit in the scene is the Gaffer, but seeing as the Gaffer is meant to be Sam's father, it doesn't seem as likely. Regardless of who's who, we can assume the table is comprised of the Gaffer, Sandyman, Ted Sandyman, Sam and Frodo, which would be a combination of 2 different conversations in 2 different chapters of the book. And speaking of conversations, another change is in regards to Sam himself. You see, in the movie, Sam sits at the table and stares at Rosie Cotton, who he already knows pretty well in the books, by the way, but their relationship aside, something odd is that Sam doesn't speak the whole time. Whereas, as I just mentioned previously, the parallel moment in the book is one in which Sam talks quite a bit. In fact, he talks a lot. But in the movies, they kept it brief and didn't give him the lines. Plus, this scene is extended edition only, so some of you might not even recognize it. If you don't, then this is your reminder that we only go by the extended edition here, as that is the only correct way to watch the trilogy. Next, I want to briefly mention the Nazgul. In the films, we see 2 different instances of them with a hobbit. First, let's quickly address the guy that they needlessly slash on their way to the Shire. We don't really know the identity of this hobbit, and it isn't a moment that Tolkien writes about. In fact, the Black Riders don't really needlessly kill like that in the books. And we know this because of Farmer Maggot, which brings us to the second moment with a hobbit and a Black Rider. In a later chapter of the book, there's a moment when Farmer Maggot recalls to Frodo and Sam an encounter he had with a Black Rider. We can assume that Peter Jackson was drawing inspiration from this because the hobbit we see looks like a farmer, he's distantly removed from Hobbiton, and he has a dog, which is one of Farmer Maggot's most notable characteristics. Now, I don't think this is exactly supposed to be Farmer Maggot himself, as we did get a glimpse of the character during the time that the 4 hobbits are running from him in his field, but they really did this hobbit dirty in the films, because in the books, Farmer Maggot stands up to the Black Rider and kicks him off his property. The scene is a parallel because in the books, the Black Rider asks Farmer Maggot where the Shire and Baggins are, just like we see in the films. But in the book, Farmer Maggot tells the Black Rider to go back where he came from, and after the Rider offers to pay him gold to be a spy, Maggot declines the bribe and threatens to sick his dogs on him. This is an amazing part of the book, and it really showcases the courage of some hobbits. I can just imagine a 3-foot-tall hobbit threatening the Witch King himself on a massive black horse. But anyway, to go back to my point about Nazgul needlessly killing, we see them slash a hobbit to bits just for asking who goes there. But in the books, when a hobbit full-on threatens his dogs on the Rider, they just turn and leave. They would rather have someone under their control and dominion than to just kill them and draw unnecessary attention, as they don't really have full power yet and they don't want to reveal any plans. So this might be the first change that I disagree with in regards to the story. Farmer Maggot is such a boss, and it's unfortunate that in order to fit things in time-wise for the movie, they had to make him a coward. Okay, so now let's discuss Gandalf and Frodo in Bag End. First, in the films we see Gandalf jump scare Frodo at night. In the books, although Gandalf does show up at night, they only talk a little bit, and Gandalf saves the remainder of their conversation for the next morning when the sun is out. This is because Gandalf didn't want to have that dark of a conversation during the nighttime. This change also plays into another small change regarding Sam eavesdropping. In the books, Tolkien mentions how they could hear shears outside the window in the garden, and it was during the morning, and it is Sam's job to be the gardener, so there's nothing suspicious about that. But at a certain point in their conversation, things start to get quiet, and Tolkien makes a note that no gardening could be heard outside. It is then after this that Gandalf realizes that Sam has been listening to the latter part of their conversation, and he pulls him inside. Before Sam gets pulled in, Gandalf and Frodo have a whole conversation in which Gandalf describes many things. He tells Frodo about the ring and the account of Isildur, he tells him the story of Deagol and Smeagol and how Gollum became who he is, and then he tells him about his hunt for Gollum as well. This helps to fill Frodo in on where he's been for the last 9 years. As mentioned in the character category, we don't really see the story of Deagol and Smeagol until the Return of the King film, but in the books we are fully filled in on who Gollum is from chapter 2. Lastly, in the books, Frodo is a lot more filled in on the darkness approaching than he is in the movies. For 17 years he's been conversing with dwarves and other travelers on the road that goes through the Shire. The dwarves have been leaving their mountains and heading west away from the growing shadow. Frodo has learned of wars, darkness creeping through the land, and more. So by the time Gandalf gets to him, he's kinda like, yeah, I already know this. The main news to him is about the ring and Sauron himself. And that wraps up these 4 scenes from the Fellowship of the Ring. If you enjoyed this analysis and maybe even learned something new, please leave a like and subscribe to keep up with all of my future episodes as I continue this series. Check out the first 2 episodes if you haven't already, and as always, comment your thoughts below on these changes Peter Jackson and his team made for these scenes. If you noticed anything that I missed, please leave a comment below so that everybody else can check in on that. Until next time, have a great week and see you in the next episode.